All right, everybody, welcome back. Back-to-back sessions here at our event, from instructional design to Dungeons and Dragons, the Chronicles of Educaria. Let me see. Let's see. Wendy. Hello, Wendy. And I'm just checking to make sure that we have people logging into the room. Yes, absolutely. Tristan is back. There's Keegan again. All right. So many of you probably know Tom. Tom McDowall has been around the training, learning, and development community for years now. He is the chief learning geek at Evolve Learning Design, and also host of the Ideas podcast. You also have something that I see every once in a while that I check out that is just, you have something streaming on YouTube all the time, it seems like.
Yeah. The Instructional Design Tips channel has like a constant stream of our most popular videos. So
excellent. Yeah, I've seen that. And today you're going to be talking about storytelling, strategy, and sensitivity, the workplace power of D&D. Tom, I'm so glad that you're part of this event. I didn't know how much of a D&D geek you were. I mean, it was J-Rock, I think, that told me, he's like, dude, you got to get Tom on this. So, and I'm glad that we were able to fit you in. And I appreciate you taking the time out. You're logging in all the way from the UK. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just hide myself from the screen and let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And just to think, logging in from the UK, this is great because this is now like the end of the working day for me. So this is perfectly timed. And yes, whilst it's always my joke that my office is set up for a lot of different things, primarily what my office is set up for is D&D, to be honest, with lights and whatnot for running games. So maybe we'll take a look at that later on if we've got time. But let me just start by sharing my screen. So, I mean, first of all, I think I've just got to say that this event is freaking awesome. So thank you so much, Louise, for putting it on, making it a thing. I think the most exciting thing for me, other than just getting to talk about D&D in a workplace environment and people not rolling their eyes at me, is that I think a lot of people, for the very first time, are going to look at sort of bringing together, whether it's D&D and L&D or just their passion outside of the L&D world, how they might be able to bring it into the L&D world, and how it's not just self-serving, how it can be really impactful. And that's kind of the theme of this session. In some ways, it's a little bit of a look back as opposed to forwards at a case study where I used D&D as part of, as well, pretty much as the entirety of several development programs across a couple of organizations. So we'll take a little look at what that looked like and how it had to be adapted to make that work, how you can do it too, but also at the results of doing so. So just to get started then, a little bit of background, because I feel like this is somewhere where probably do need to establish some nerd credentials. The 3rd edition Player's Handbook was the first D&D book I ever got properly. Prior to that, I actually had a red box that I'd picked up at a charity shop, not really understanding what it was. I got the 3rd edition handbook brand new at the age of 10. So thus, prior to that, struggled with the red box books. They're quite tricky at that age. Immediately fell in love with this. I had already discovered the worlds of wargaming and toy soldiers and ranked battles, but this was something completely different. This, to me, immediately was about storytelling. It was about people. It was about connection. It was about small bands outnumbered against greater odds. This was everything that I'd read in fantasy and science fiction novels that couldn't be captured by wargaming, that was very much focused on thousands of people in ranked formations fighting, perhaps either fantasy worlds or perhaps Napoleonics and things like that. But very quickly on from there came 3.5, as I think did for most people. From there, of course, 4th, we're not going to talk about 4th. I played Pathfinder like everyone else with any sense, and then came back for 5th. Now, if you caught J-Rock's session yesterday, I will put my hand up and say I played D&D wrong, at least according to him. So I do play 5th as a story-focused game. It is all about the tale being told by everyone around the table and not so much about the mechanics. But most importantly for me, this spawned what could best be described as a paper, dice, and toy soldier addiction. See selection below. And if we were to highlight any great danger of getting into D&D, I think this is it. You will never have enough books. You will never own enough dice. There will always be a figure you haven't quite got, or a terrain piece you'd love to have for your map. It's the bane of my marriage and indeed my bank balance. But we've come to an uneasy truce in that as long as I keep it in the office, it's fine. So that's where it lives. But without sort of focusing too much on the D&D aspect of all this, what I really want to talk about is a little bit about one game in 3 organizations. This is what I rolled out a few years ago now. It must be coming on for 4 years ago. I did the last one, where we used D&D as the primary tool in aiding 3 different organizations in their sort of personal development focuses. So the 3 different types of businesses that were involved were a contact center, a financial services organization, and a civil engineering firm. 3 pretty different cases, I think you'll agree. In each case, we actually ran 3 mini campaigns in the contact center, 3 mini campaigns in the financial services organization, and only 2 in the civil engineering firm because that was all their employees. They were a much smaller organization in that sense. But you can see here, when we look at the skill areas that were identified by the organization and by me when I came in as being the challenging areas, there's a lot of overlap. Ownership, morale, teamwork and collaboration, reliance on direct instruction from their line managers, poor emotional intelligence, low communication skills, the fact that they were getting to grips with remote teams, a lot of strained relationships, inability to compromise, lack of decision-making skills, no communication. I think it would be fair to say when I went into the civil engineering firm, I've never seen so many grown adults be totally unable to just communicate with each other. It's that classic example of everyone in the room is an expert, and they actually are. Like, they're incredibly intelligent, incredibly well trained, to the point where they know they're right and so are utterly unwilling to even consider another solution. That's really challenging in the workplace. And training in that area, they'd all done loads. They'd all run development programs. They'd all done the blue sky card activities. They'd all done the reflective practice exercises. So I'm not ashamed to say this was a bit of the last roll of the dice for them, which I think, good pun, right? Not deliberate. But I think this is why they were so cool with me going, what if we just played D&D? And it wasn't an easy sell, but sold it was. And so for that year's development budget for personal development, we trialed just playing D&D. Now, that's not strictly true. We didn't just play D&D. Obviously, those that have run a D&D campaign before will know that may go really well, it may go really badly, but also in this scenario, these people weren't D&D players. They were normal people with lives and relationships and money in their bank accounts that hasn't been spent on books or models or maps. So it needed some adaptation. Let's dive into what that actually looked like. First things first, target skills. What was the point? If I was going to get these businesses to literally pay me to have their people whilst being paid play D&D, we needed to figure out what was going to change. We narrowed it down to communication skills, empathy and emotional intelligence, storytelling and expression, and problem solving and decision making. I say narrow it down. That's like a big old chunk of interpersonal skills. But this was enough. If I said this will improve, having played D&D for years, I knew it had this power because I've played D&D with a lot of people. I'm sure those of us that have run games, we've seen it in our players. We've seen these things come from the most introverted or poor communicator or someone who usually doesn't think about other people. When in character, they're a different person. That's kind of the benefit of the whole thing. So I was confident we could move metrics in those areas. Now, here's the big concept. Don't ruin D&D. D&D has been crafted for decades by some of the greatest living and some sadly dead minds in the world of game design. You're not going to improve it by throwing your L&D nonsense into it. You don't want to be starting your sessions with, and in this play session, you will learn. No. You don't want the big bad's name to be the CEO's name. You don't want the town in which this experience happens to be the name of your business or some slightly ropey version thereof. Instead, this program's focus was on how do we get as close as possible to actually just playing D&D. And really, this came down to thinking about those skill groups again. How does D&D help with communication? And as I go through these, please do feel free to jump into the chat. It's a little bit further away than I was thinking, so I can't read it, so I have to lean in a little bit because my eyesight's terrible. But when it comes to communication, I mean, there's the obvious stuff, right? You have to talk to play the game. It's a role-playing game. You must communicate. But it's not just as simple as talking to other people. There's interplayer communication. There's communication with NPCs. There's communication through action. There's communication through choice when creating your characters about what they are like as people, as characters, what your communication style is going to be. When it comes to empathy and emotional intelligence, that probably sits more in the DM's world because there is a huge risk when playing D&D. And those that have done for a long while will know the term murder hobo. This is basically where you have a party of people with no attachment to the world around them. They do not care about anything. All they want to do is go from place to place, kill stuff, and get gold. That is not a helpful campaign to run in the workplace. And so real thought has to be given to the idea of how do I make sure that doesn't happen? How do I ensure that there are moments that will challenge them, to show empathy, or challenge them to have emotional intelligence and read into the feelings of others, or that there will be consequences for not? The storytelling and expression one will take care of itself so long as you remember a couple of really basic rules that we'll dig into later. But this is, I think, the most challenging one if you have a group like the civil engineers who are very used to being very precise, very exact, and the idea of creative expression and storytelling can be challenging to them. It can be scary to a lot of people to just be like, yeah, I'm just going to make the answer up and we're all going to roll with it. Because let's face it, in most of our jobs, we do that, we get sacked eventually. Hopefully. If not, you end up with a marvelously incompetent senior leader. Not that that's ever happened on that kind of basis, obviously. But you really want to factor in the fact that they're going to struggle with that. And so, as the DM or the facilitator, you're going to have to lift some of that load for them. And finally, problem solving and decision making. Very often in D&D, when all else fails, you can hit stuff or a wizard can fix it. You can't have those problems be the default if this is going to really promote problem solving and decision making. There has to be alternatives. There need to be opportunity to solve puzzles, to solve things through communication, to take a different route, or for there to be very real consequences for resorting to the easiest, quickest solution, which unnervingly often in D&D turns out to be extreme and sudden violence. Again, not that you want to promote it, but it's going to happen. And you never want to be in a position where you're just saying no to players. So plan ahead and think about how you're going to introduce these things. And with that, let's talk a little bit about the campaign itself. There is a bit of a roadmap for this. Now, a D&D campaign can be never-ending. Most of mine don't have a set end date. They can be one-shots where you literally sit down, play, and by the time you get up, the story's going to be done. Or they can be kind of short-form campaigns. In this scenario, what I put together was that this would be done over a 3-month period. As with all such plans, this did not quite go according to plan. In pretty much all of them, we did actually stick to about 3 months, but in one of them, we did it in just over a week. That was hyper interesting, and the results were wildly different to every other group. And we'll kind of touch on that later. I'm not going to say it was bad, though. It was wildly different, but really, really kind of hyper condensed the whole experience in terms of timeline, but also in terms of impact. So there were some sort of really key considerations if you are going to do this on a really short timescale that we'll talk through. But on a basic level, this is what the campaign looked like. We started off actually before a session 0 with just a real simple, who wants to play what? Don't need to worry about learning D&D. Here's what a fighter and a monk and a rogue are. Which one sounds cool? If you could be any of these, which would you be? Cool. Done. That's pretty much character creation done for them in terms of the mechanics. Because you're not there to teach everyone how to play D&D. That's not what the business is paying for, and it's not actually helpful. Chances are they got other stuff on. If they, at the end of this, discover they love D&D, awesome. Sell them a book, make some commission. You'll be rich by the end of it. Sell them some of your minifigures and maps so that you can buy new ones. But then, session 0 isn't actually about character creation as it might be in a normal D&D session. It becomes about introducing characters to each other and exploring connection, exploring who they are as people. It effectively, in terms of how you run it, becomes the little opening vignettes of your story. Those moments at the start of a fantastic old black and white movie where each character and its relationship to the others is introduced in these short little scenes. It also allows each player a moment in the spotlight at the start where they can start to feel out their character, where they can try out a silly voice and go, nope, not doing that for the rest of this for this thing. That's going to be really silly. Or maybe they think they're going to be this unattached, wandering nomad, and then they realize actually, they have a wife and 3 kids in the village, and that's why this whole thing is important to them. It's a moment to challenge any sort of preconceptions they have about how they're going to engage or how awkward this whole thing's going to be, like role playing as a group of adults that don't do this. And, you will get a group of very different people in the room and they're all new. So give them that leeway, let them relax into it and give them their little moments at the start that basically let them stand up and go, yeah, I'm really cool and this is why. Everyone loves to start that way. Then we have 4 what are called play sessions, and we'll dive deeper into these. In each one of those, there are 3 elements. The actual session of D&D, a character reflection element, and a personal reflection element. You have 4 of those, and then the 6th meeting across this 3-month period is a campaign debrief and roundtable. And we'll look into what the objectives are of that as we move through. So first of all, let's look at character creation for D&D. These first 3 are pretty standard. What's your character's map of the world? Is it a cruel place or a good place? How did they get to where they are today? And do they have like a really well-defined path forwards from where they are today, or are they a bit lost? Are they a leader or a follower? And what makes a really great leader in their mind? Who do they follow and why? And then goals, not just, eggs, bacon, newspaper from the shop tomorrow, must remember. No, what's their North Star, their ultimate goal? When all the chips are down, what keeps them going? And who are they answerable if they don't achieve their goals? And finally, are those goals of their own choice? Or are they caught up in circumstance or trapped by destiny or being press-ganged into something by some unseen master? These are all pretty standard D&D questions, but they can totally all still lead you to the world of the murder hobo. They can lead you to a campaign that is just very linear, very straight line, and characters that don't matter. And so in this particular instance, we ask, what does your character fear? Is it a person or a people or a situation, or are they afraid all the time and why? A character who's afraid is a character who will avoid situations if they can. And that is a very challenging dynamic within a group of people. It's also a very common behavior that causes friction in the workplace, those who will not face a challenge. Regrets. What do characters regret? What do they wish they had or hadn't done, and what would they take back if they could? A character with regret comes scarily close to a real person, because that kind of depth inherently creates a wealth of backstory that we can tap into when telling the wider tale without the player ever having to write a word. They regret the way they treated their parents. Perfect, don't need to know anymore. We can now spin a whole story around that if we need to. But immediately it gets the player into that headspace of, oh yeah, that if I've said it, clearly it matters enough to the character for that to be their regret that they're listing here. It becomes part of how they'll play that character. And finally, attachment. Don't make unattachment an easy road to go down. every player in D&D these days seems to want to play the unattached orphan who lost everything, or whose parents died in a whatever that might have happened, or someone who lost it all or has never had anything. Basically, they want no attachments to the world around them. They've reached enlightenment, and yet for some reason are going on an adventure. It doesn't really make any sense, but it does make role-playing very easy, which is why people tend to reach for it. Don't allow it. Or if someone is going to have no attachments, how have they got no attachments? Why do they have no attachments? Really drive down that road. Those additional 3 points will create characters that it is much easier to tie into situations where emotional intelligence, empathy, and communication are the only way forwards. And those are some key skills we said we wanted to shift. So there they are. Next up then. Everyone probably recognizes a SWOT analysis, and we've basically just done one. We've identified what the strengths and weaknesses of a character are. We've identified what they're seeking and what they're fleeing from or are afraid of. This makes businesses happy because it looks like a proper businessy thing to do. We're not just playing a game anymore. But also, having this, and when you're running the game, these are basically a map of plot points that this character will bite on every single time you put in front of them, because they're made for them. It also provides your first-time players, because almost everyone you do this with will be a first-time player, with a really strong guide as to what matters to their character. Because they will need reminding, because we're not used to being someone else. We're used to being us. We're pretty good at being us most of the time. So being someone else is challenging if you're not used to it, and this will help. Next up, some rules. Every good game has them, and it's really important that we remember a few if we're going to run a game like this. First of all, the rules are your problem, not the player's problem. No one is there to learn how to play D&D. You need to give them as little information as possible on the mechanics, not to your advantage, but just to ensure that their focus is on the story, the role-playing. Not on, and does advantage stack or does disadvantage cancel it out straight away? And if I've got a +1, but they've got a weakness to... No. They just need to be told, roll that dice and it does this, let's tell a story. Next up, create simple character sheets and play guides. The D&D character sheet is a thing of beauty when filled out properly, but is wildly confusing when put in front of a first-time player. Don't expect your people to learn it. Instead, give them several sheets of paper and a guide on how to play their character. If they've got spells, give them cards with their spells on. If they can cast a fireball 3 times in a day, give them 3 fireball cards that they can give to you as the DM each time they cast a fireball. Make their life in terms of play mechanics as easy as possible. This allows them to focus on what would my character do as opposed to what can my character do. What can my character do is not actually useful in terms of our development objectives. What would my character do? Very useful. That's where all the magic happens. And finally, for you running this thing, everything, no matter what the ask is, no matter what the decision is a yes and scenario. There's no situation in which it's a case of, no, you cannot do that. Now, you may want to warn them that that will almost certainly kill you or someone else or everyone, but it's not a no. The moment you introduce no into the conversation, they were wrong. And they might feel that they look a little bit silly. And it does not take much, even with the very best DM at the table, to break immersion for first-time players. And the moment any of them feel silly or that they messed up the story, they will recede into themselves, and you have almost certainly lost your opportunity in this campaign to really reach out and impact that person. So everything is a yes and. There may be a consequence, there may be an unforeseen turn of events coming up next, but it all starts with a yes. So those are the kind of hard and fast rules. Much like D&D, at least in my book, everything else is up for grabs because it doesn't really matter. Next up, let's dive into what those play sessions looked like. They're basically made up of 3 sections. Now, each of those play sessions on the original roadmap represent a full day. And this is really important. This is not an approach that can be condensed or could have been condensed into less time. The 6 points on that map are 6 days. So when we condensed it into just over a week, we did session 0 on a Friday, and then Monday to Friday the next week, we did the rest of the campaign. Otherwise, 3 months is a much more sensible ask. 6 months is too long, there's too far between sessions, memory fades, reflections are too far apart, all that kind of thing. Of your roughly 6.5 to 7 hour real working day, you're going to want to spend 5, maybe 5.5 hours playing D&D, each of the play sessions. You're then going to want to allow half an hour to 45 minutes for the character reflection, and the personal reflection is actually done in their own time or their own working time, important point to stress, after the session itself, ideally after 2 or 3 days between the sessions. If you do the hyper condensed version, you actually cut off the personal reflection as part of the play days, because it gets in the way more than it helps. Instead, your hyper condensed days become play the D&D session, do the character reflection, play the D&D session, do the character reflection in very quick succession for the first 4 days of the week. If we take a little bit of a dive in, this is what the character reflections look like. Now, following every session, the characters sit down and do this by themselves, and it is the characters that sit down and do this. Key moments in that session. What happened? What did they do? What were their successes and failures? And what notes would they add about their party relationships, their relationships to other members of the party, the other characters? Then they note down what their characters' emotional states have been like during this session and what knowledge they've gained. Finally, they write about their NPC relationships, whether they're pre-existing or new or developing or getting worse. And then what's changed since the start of the session to now, and what's next. And the incredible thing is, and we saw this right from session 1 in almost all cases, is that the what's next, where I expected to see, yes, we'll move to the next dungeon, or we'll do this, or I'll capture so-and-so. No, what I saw was, must speak to such and such because they mentioned this. Need to check in with X because they seemed upset about. That emotional intelligence and the poor communication skills and the lack of empathy that were being mentioned about these people, our players, ahead of the first session, in character, I don't think I've ever seen people be more empathetic or aware of what other people were saying. I don't think I've ever seen a group of players so immediately prioritize the kind of, that NPC seemed upset about something, we must go and speak to them. This member of my party hasn't done much, I need to make sure they're okay. That was a really fascinating kind of first flag when we delivered these to go, hey, something is happening here. Not quite sure what it is yet, but something's happening here. Now, really importantly, these character reflection canvases are shared with the DM, but they are not shared between characters, because characters don't know what each other are thinking. That would break the whole immersion piece. But they will be referenced later on. Now, the flip side of that, as I mentioned, is the player reflections. Now, you need to give players space to reflect in their own time and in a way that works for them. What I really loved to do was give them the Kobold Soul notebooks. So it still had a nice kind of D&D wrapper around it, and they were nice and in one place. But you could just as easily give them, pucker pads or business notebooks or whatever you want to do. The important thing is that a couple of days after each session, they stop and think about what it was like to play. Did they enjoy it? What did they take away from it? Are they looking forward to the next session? Would they like to play this again? How do they feel about the people they played with? What frustrated them about playing with the different people around the table? And put it all in the notebook. Again, not to be shared with anyone at this stage. Really important step, that, but a step that gets dropped, at least initially, in the hyper-condensed version. You can see why if you try and do kind of the session and the character and then the personal, there's no time to really reflect on the personal stuff. Not really, not enough time. So then we get to that last point, the campaign debrief and roundtable. And I know I'm going through these at a bit of a whistle-stop pace. I'm keen to make sure we get through everything. And then if anyone wants to dive in with questions or dive into anything deeper, we certainly can do. So the campaign debrief and roundtable really is about that. Okay, so we've played D&D, and that's awesome. That's been really good fun. But let's, bring this back down to earth a little bit, but not with a kind of massive immersion destroying, right, the fun is over, the police are back. No, instead, we're going to try and do it in a much more gentle way. So the first thing is I very much refer to this as like the players roundtable at the end. If you see like an actual play, like a Critical Role or a Dimension 20, they'll often do like a players roundtable at the end of a campaign, and it will be, hello, my name is X and I played Y. Let me tell you about my story. And that is very much the start of this thing. Each of these characters and their players are present, as well as the DM, to talk about the story they just told together, to talk about the relationships they just created, to talk about the game they just hopefully enjoyed playing. From the start, the DM's job here is to deliver a little bit of an epilogue, to wrap out the story, make sure everything finishes well, and to fix stuff. Now, there is always the danger when running D&D that certain moments become tied up in mechanics. And with the best will in the world, even the very best DMs sometimes get caught up in how the rules say things are supposed to be done. Now, especially in this campaign, you want to avoid that, but almost certainly at some point it will happen, because it just does. So this is a moment to kind of address that, to gloss over it. In the retelling of the story of the past 4 sessions, you skip over and you smooth over the 15 minutes you spent trying to figure out what happened. Instead, it's just, this happened, and the story continues. Then there are really 2 objectives to the roundtable. From a character's perspective, they're going to discuss key moments, connections that they made, and any regrets they have. They get the opportunity to kind of relive those badass moments where like, oh, do you remember when this happened, or I did this, and then you did that, and bounce off each other. But they also get to reveal things that maybe no one uncovered, or that they were keeping secret. From a player perspective, they get to discuss their experience of playing their character and playing with the other players. And that's where their personal reflections come in, because this is where they're going to be challenged to tell the other people about what it was like to play with them, to tell them how great it was when they were able to overcome that thing together, or how challenging it was when their point of view was completely ignored. 2 real points here. What was challenging and what did they learn? Those are the key moments right at the end of the roundtable. This is the only moment where, L&D weeds its way in properly and goes, ha, it was all training all along. Just with those 2 questions at the end. And it's really important that that's when that is. Once all this has come round and we're coming back, we're getting closer and closer to leaving the game and going back into the world of work. That's when the L&D style questions can really come in and not shatter immersion. Because ultimately, that is the power of D&D when it comes to these experiences. It's creating an immersive but abstract experience. It's taking people out of the day-to-day, which so often traps them in not being able to talk about interpersonal relationships or how they're doing emotionally, or really think about whether or not they are showing empathy to their colleagues. Communication is actually quite an abstract thing. Often we'll go, oh yeah, they need to work on their communication skills. Cool, what does that actually mean? These are big issues that so often get lost in the detail of day-to-day work. Stepping out of that, whether it's to an away day in the Alps and skiing and all that nonsense, or whether it's into a fantasy world where you can be anyone or do anything, getting away from the minutiae of work helps an awful lot. One also costs an awful lot more than the other. So there's a really good argument that D&D is actually fantastic for business efficiency compared to corporate away days. So, hey, if you want to sell it to someone, that's the way. Finally, let's talk about the impact this particular delivery had. So, 47 players in 8 campaigns between 3 organizations. 10 hours of dedicated reflection per player as a minimum. That actually doesn't count the personal reflection time, of course, because you're deliberately being hands off with that. But that's kind of your last session plus the player reflections. And finally, of those 47, 98.59%, or all but 3 of them, were rated as improved in all the target skill groups by their line managers. And that was done on a 3 and then 6 month post game basis. Now, is that perfect? No. Line managers are themselves entirely fallible. They could just have said, yes, they're awesome. So this isn't a hard metric. But it's a really good steer to say these people's line managers actively reported seeing a positive improvement in the target areas simply because they sat and played D&D and then talked about it for a bit. Something the nerdy amongst us have been doing for decades. With some metrics out of the way, I want to give you some great resources if this is something you would like to try or explore or consider. First of all, D&D educator resources. Wizards of the Coast, for all their flaws, have actually created a whole range of stuff aimed at schools. Now, it's aimed at schools, so it's not directly, lift and shift over to the world of corporate. However, in amongst that are great examples of how you can simplify the rules of D&D. Or if you yourself have never played, but you want to run this for people in your business, that is a great place to start, because a lot of teachers are in the same boat when they decide to use the Educators Pack. D&D Beyond allows you to create digital characters very quickly, very easily, so you haven't got sheets of paper all over the place. Very helpful. Also a great place for storing digital rules. Tabletop Dominion have tons of guidelines around how to start D&D campaigns, how to create NPCs and town names and maps that, again, you don't want to waste a lot of time on when you're running this from this perspective, but you are going to need. And then Young Minds inspired lesson plans. These, again, are aimed at schools, but the core of them are very applicable. There are even some in there that do focus on empathy and emotional intelligence and cultural awareness. So you can very much take inspiration from them. Pardon me. That is pretty much everything I can tell you about the way I ran it. But if you've got any questions, now's the time if I don't die. So yes, any questions, more than welcome. Let's have a look. Sorry, I did say the chat was a long way away from me and my eyesight's getting worse day by day. So let's have a look.
I'm sure questions are going to come in, Tom, but
it's okay if they're not. I'm not very interesting, so we can just go. That's fine by me.
Tom, I have seen you do quite a few sessions. I don't know. I don't know how many I've seen you do. Now, all the ones that you've done with TLDC. This is like by far like one. I mean, it's just excellent. If I'm standing up right now, but I would just give you a standing ovation. Great stuff, Tom. You're obviously passionate about the game and what you do, and it just really showed through in this session. Yeah, look at that. Peter Dillon, pure gold.
Oh, good. Oh, I like that one. How do you get over the mandatory fun attitude that some people have? Oh, I love that. Do you know what? That's really difficult, because there will be some people that don't want to play D&D, as shocking as that may be. Right? There are people in this world that are like, nah, it's not for me. They're wrong, obviously, but we have to persuade them. And I think the biggest thing there is when you have those initial conversations is kind of just having that chat around, look, first of all, we're going to play 4 times. If you play 4 times and then you say, nah, never again, hey, that is totally fine. It's entirely your loss. But I think fun is the problem there. We go, oh, it's going to be really good fun. Don't say that. Don't tell them they're going to have fun. That's their choice. The issue people have, at least that because I hate mandatory fun. The moments we go, oh, we're going to have a really fun activity. It's like, no, we're not. We're going to run an activity and I'm probably going to hate it because you should be really cheerful because we're not in the office. How is that inherently fun? A lot of people, take us, for example, we love what we do. We probably quite enjoy what we do. I would describe e-learning development at times as really good fun, but that was my job. Something that wasn't was taking me away from fun. So rather than pitching it as, oh, let's play D&D, it's fun, it's, we're going to play D&D. Now, obviously, it's a really famous game, but I think it could really help us explore X, Y, and Z elements and skill development. Don't sell it to them as fun because that's entirely their choice. And I think that's the issue that people have with mandatory fun is that they are told they will have fun whether they like it or not. It's a bit like someone telling you, you will love this book. It's like, that's not your choice to make. And that, I think, is how you get around it all the time, not just with D&D. Never sell someone that something's going to be fun. Tell them it's going to be helpful. And if they find it fun, more's the better.
Love it. Okay, we've got some good questions over in the QA area of the interface. So here's one. Here's one from William, who I think Natalie was calling Adam, but were there any instances when players discussed negative interactions with other players during the roundtable? If so, can you share the experience?
Yeah, there were some really awkward ones, actually, because we straight up had someone come out and say, it was actually another male player who took on another one and said, I feel like you completely disregarded what the rogue, in this case, wanted to do, largely because she's a woman. And the table just went silent. And it was like, and I've seen you do that in the office as well. And it was at that moment that I thought, this is either going to be the biggest breakthrough this office has ever had, or I am sacked tomorrow. One of the two. There is no in between at this point. But it led to a really we did not get to a resolution. Let's be totally clear. There are some problems that a quick chat around a table not going to solve. However, it opened that conversation up because this person was blindsided. They're like, I had no idea I had this, that people thought this. It really shocked them. It shocked me as well because I'd known them for years. And it's a bit kind of like, okay, head down, not my place to. Yeah, weirdly, it's one of the few moments as a DM where your job is to shut up and back off, let the conversation happen. There were less extreme examples, however. There were a lot of kind of like, oh, I think we rushed to that decision because certain people led the way. The prime example was a lot of parties will have experienced fighter drag. The fighters decide we're going left, well, then the party's going left, otherwise everyone's going to die. And they experience that, and then they had to discuss, well, that wasn't good for all of us. So sometimes it was very human-led, and other times it was very character-driven. And you could see that in character selection sometimes. You could see that that was going to happen and kind of cackle maniacally as a DM as you watch these. Well, you knew this conversation was going to happen because of the people that went, I'm going to be the person at the front. And you're like, okay, I bet that happens a lot in the office as well. Not to be too sort of psychoanalysis hat on, but you could see those conversations coming a mile off quite often. But occasionally you got those surprise ones. It's amazing how once you put that element of abstraction on what's happened, people are much more willing to tie it to the real world and talk about it than if it's just the real world stuff. So yeah, I would probably say 35, maybe even 40% of the interactions that just get discussed at the round table are things that people were unhappy with, as opposed to things that went really well. Which was a surprise to me because I thought people would be very hesitant. But it seems that actually they're quite willing to have it out, as it were. If it's not actually them that's involved, it's all make-believe. It helps. Wow.
That's great. That's great. All right, next one. Let's see here. Can you share a sample of how you pitch this to stakeholders?
On bended knee, basically. No. These were all clients that I had worked with before. And I knew, having done other things inside their businesses, that they were really struggling with this. And this was an idea that I had had in the back of my head for a long time. Not just because I wanted to play D&D, but when the first wave of kind of like gamification in learning, like real like video game style gamification came along, I was not a huge fan, largely because I'm not a huge fan of video games. But it did get me thinking about how could we utilize other types of games. And there were board games like Trivial Pursuit to test your product knowledge. And I always thought that was a bit kind of like, yeah, but it's a bit naff, isn't it? It's a bit L&D. It's the L&D version of Trivial Pursuit, an even more boring version of Trivial Pursuit. That's what the world needed. So how could we do this and actually make it a real game? And this just kind of always stuck with me. I ended up in a meeting with them and just said, hey, look, the first time was just hey, look, here's a really crazy idea. What if we did something like this? Now, after that conversation, it was easily 4 or 5 months until we got the yes. It took a really long time. The second business, however, I had a business case. I had an example to go, did it, it worked, it's awesome, we should do it again. The biggest problem they had was, what's this going to cost? So the first one, I just straight up did it for free. So I will give you my time, I will give you the resources, I just want to know if this works. And hey, everything else has failed, because when you look at the actual impact of sensitivity training or emotional intelligence training or empathy-focused e-learning, for example, we all kind of know it struggles in terms of having an impact. So what's the harm in trying something new? Now, there are businesses that would just say, yeah, no, there's plenty of harm that could be done, we're not interested. And that's fine. This is never going to be adopted by hyper corporate, starched collar businesses, I suspect, at least not for a very long time. And so, you target the businesses that do have a bit more flex, that do want to experiment. And whereas currently they might be going, let's experiment with AI, or let's experiment with an external mentoring platform. Instead, just say to them, hey, what if I came and ran a couple of D&D sessions for some of your people and we see what impact it's going to have? Keep it really casual, really simple. Don't promise the earth. And then if it has an impact, you then have your inbuilt business case to go, hey, let's expand this. Or at least that's what I did.
Love it. Okay, got a couple more questions, then we have to run and prep for the next session. But Jessica is asking, can you describe one of the conflicts you had them encounter where they had to use problem solving, collaboration rather than fighting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the best ones was actually one of the kind of climaxes of one of the stories was they were basically faced with a series of choices. There was this great library of arcane knowledge that had the potential to be lost forever, that their whole story built up around it. Several of them were involved in it, etc., etc. And the people of the village would be lost. They had to decide which one or both would they split the party. And in saving the library, because that group did actually decide that the knowledge was more important than the people. That was an interesting thing to discuss later, let me tell you. But they decided to save the library, and so they went into the kind of the labyrinthine depths of the library. They faced straight up, challenge puzzles, like sliding things around on the floor. They faced some things that had to be a combination of puzzle solving and combat skills. They faced some things that they couldn't overcome, and so they had to decide whether or not to fail entirely or back off and go a different way and sacrifice one part of the library to save another. What would they sacrifice? All those kinds of things. It's really difficult to create those encounters because people can bulldoze their way through them. It's all about establishing the importance of not within stories. It's a bit like having hidden, the last thing you want is like a railroad story. There are going to be rails, of course there are, especially in 4 sessions, but the art of this is to make them as invisible as possible, to make the to make the player care so much about what they're talking about, they don't want to bulldoze through it. And that's character creation, I guess, comes into that stage. But that's probably the best example of where it's not just a brute force solution.
Love it. Okay, let's see. And we got a couple more. Wait, let's see. Kim here. Let me show this one on stage. Kim's asking, would all players be at the same org level? Would a more senior leader assume that they'd lead the team in the campaign or not be okay as a follower?
That's the interesting one. So we deliberately did have mixed groups in every single one. And it was the whole point of that was to say, yes, in your real life, you are a senior leader of da-da-da. But here, you are a level 10 monk, and they're a level 10 rogue, and they're a level 10 fighter, and whatever's going to happen. And then we see what happens with the leadership dynamics, because that led to a lot of interesting conversations around why can't you let go of the leadership role? Why don't you trust others to lead? So yeah, I think having mixed groups can make it more challenging. But again, I think that's on us when we're setting up the world to strip all that away during character creation to allow people to step out of their normal roles.
Amazing. Tom, have you ever talked about this have you done a presentation on this before?
No, this is the first. This was kind of, it's one of those ones where do you present this?
Right. No, totally.
Where do you go? Let's do D&D at work. So no, this was really nice to be able to dust this off and be like, hey, look, it can be done.
Because it's fantastic. This is so great. This is your jam. I mean,
hey, anyone wants D&D played in their businesses? I'm there. That's I'll do it for free. I don't care.
I know. I think that there's a whole group of people here now that have just learned so much from this session and your experience. And I know it definitely has my brain just spinning. Just a lot going on. So yeah, there you go. Kim saying, recommending everyone at Cinecraft watch the replay of the session. And so, Tom, thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. And we got to do more. You are just a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and I'm just finding it's just amazing stuff. So
well,
thank you so much
for organising the event. As I said, I think this event's going to have a huge impact on people, not just D&D. It's going to be about how do I move my passion into L&D, and that's a wonderful thing for the industry. It really is. So
right, and this event, usually I do gate some of the recordings. None of these are going to be gated because I do think that this is something that everyone needs to be able to see. So they'll be on YouTube, and we'll just share them out. This is wonderful stuff, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for turning up. Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and close this session out. Next one, we're talking with Mark I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, Stoker, Conjuring Creativity for your leadership training. That one's going to be really, really interesting. He has some fun stuff planned for that one. So please join us in the next session. We have a short break. And Tom, once again, thank you. We'll see everybody in the next one. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.